This is the Nikon ZR, the first new camera in Nikon's Z Cinema line since it acquired RED. It combines many of the best modern features we've come to expect from Nikon's most recent cameras and brings RED's legendary color science and RED RAW formats into an affordable and compact body. But is it enough to finally dethrone the likes of the Sony FX3 and the Lumix S1 II as the new go-to for filmmakers and creators? Let's find out. Okay, so we were lucky enough to spend a few days putting the ZR through its paces and treat it like we would if it was our own actual camera. Some adventuring through the mountains, some overlanding, and of course, ripping the Porsches through the desert.
There's a wasp on you.
That said, these were pre-production models provided by Nikon, but this is not sponsored by them. We don't get to keep them. They have zero input in this video. And as always, I'm gonna be brutally honest about my opinions. And I've already been very transparent with Nikon about some of my negative feedback for this camera, which don't worry, we'll get to in a sec. This video does have a sponsor, and that's Storyblocks. Okay, so what is the Nikon ZR? Well, the R stands for RED. This is effectively the cine version of the Nikon Z6 III. It's got that same 24 megapixel 6K partially stacked sensor and the XP7 processor. It has all the latest and greatest autofocus we've come to expect from this generation of Nikon cameras. But the exciting thing is we now have access to REDCODE RAW internal recording with a slight caveat. But let's first talk about the build of this camera, because there is a lot to talk about here. So the first thing you notice when you pick up the Nikon ZR is the screen. It basically takes up the whole back of the camera, and this has quickly become my new favorite screen on just about any camera. It's a 4-inch 3 million dot flip screen that's insanely bright at 1000 nits of peak brightness.
You want to turn up the brightness?
This screen is crazy. Woo. With most cameras, I almost immediately want to throw on an external screen, and this is probably the first time I haven't felt that. Going back and forth shooting with the ZR and my FX3 for the behind the scenes, I felt the FX3 and I was like, wow, this screen sucks. I hate this. I do not want to use this anymore. The next thing you notice is the size. It is very small and compact, maybe too much so. I believe it's around 630 grams when you include the battery. So that's 85 grams lighter than the FX3 and then 145-ish grams heavier than the ZVE1. So it's kind of in between those two.
Man, this thing is so light.
Man,
that's a 24-70. And the difference right here, that's wild.
With that screen being so large and the camera being so small, there's very minimal space for physical buttons. You basically have the power button on the top left, 3 programmable custom buttons on the top right, a menu, playback, and joystick on the back, and then record buttons on the top and front near the lens. There's also a front and back wheel, which can be programmed to aperture, ISO, that type of thing. And there's also a really nice little zoom rocker that can either power the Nikon power zoom lenses, or it can be used to kind of help punch in to grab focus. I do very much appreciate that they've opted for a joystick rather than a D-pad. I feel like most cameras, if they're gonna only choose one, they most often include the D-pad, which I despise. So good on you, Nikon, for that one. But I will say I wish that it was on the top, because if you're holding it for video, having it on the top like you have on the FX3 is nice. Also, one minor annoyance is that I don't really love the feel of the record button. It's kind of spongy and feels like a photo shutter button rather than a video record button. And with this being a video camera, I would much prefer a different style of button, but whatever. On the one hand, it's really nice that they've kept things simple and minimal, but it also means that you're gonna find yourself digging in the menus quite a bit, which is definitely a downside for those that are used to more physical buttons on most cinema cameras. There is a new quick menu that you can access via the touchscreen, and then the menu button will either bring up the customizable I menu if you just press it, and then if you press and hold, it goes to the full menu system. The next thing that you'll notice is the grip, or lack thereof. Now, when I first saw photos of the ZR, I was like, oof, that is gonna be a problem. And I'll admit, it is better to hold in person than it looks in the photos, but it's still not great. If you're using a lighter lens setup, then the combination of a little bit of a finger bump on the front and a little bit of a moderate thumb bump on the back, it makes it usable. But as soon as you put a heavy anamorphic lens on there, or you rig it up with a monitor, or just carrying it around with a normal sized lens for an extended period of time, you do start to realize how much you're straining to pinch and hold the camera in place. I'd say honestly, even something like the little Sony ZVE1 is actually much more comfortable to hold, and that is a very small, minimally gripped camera. Now, I'll say that there are probably going to be plenty of third-party accessories for this, and I would imagine that the likes of SmallRig and Tilta and Condor Blue are going to be coming out with a cage that will probably include some form of grip. But it is a bit of a disappointment to me personally when we think about the fact that Nikon has pretty much always been known for like really nice deep grips. So it's weird to see a camera that's Nikon that feels so decidedly not Nikon in the hand. I think the expectation is that we can rig this up or slim it down just like we would the FX3, but I would have loved to have some like Q20 mounting points like we have on the FX3 if that's the direction we're gonna be going. While we're on the topic of other build related bummers, maybe I should just get a couple of these kind of harsh criticisms out of the way early. First is we only have micro HDMI. Now I know I gushed about how big the screen is, but with this being marketed as a cinema camera, there's obviously plenty of times we're gonna need to rig it up with an external monitor, and micro HDMI is just not reliable. If you've ever used a camera with micro HDMI, you know that is usually the quickest point of failure on a camera. Now we also do have dual card slots, but not really. We have a CF Express B and a micro SD. As soon as we're doing any of the video modes that make this camera shine, we're basically gonna never be able to use that micro SD. So I feel like that's really only there as like a photo backup or something like that. And like, while I think it's fine for a camera to only have one card slot at this price point, I feel like complaining about single card slots and micro HDMI, that's like a very like 2022 complaint, not something that I feel like we should still be complaining about in 2025. Also, just a heads up on the photo front, there is no mechanical shutter in photo mode. It does still take photos, and you're gonna get a great similar image to what we get on the Z6 III, but if your primary focus is photos, I would very much suggest you look at something like the Z6 III instead. Now on the flip side, let's talk about weather sealing. So Nikon is saying that this is rated for Z6 III level dust and weather sealing. Part of this is due to having a fanless design as well as a really robust hot shoe cover that I'll admit is probably the first time I've ever taken off a hot shoe cover and successfully not immediately lost it in a camera bag. Now, when we hear fanless design, alarm bells immediately start going off saying overheating could be an issue, especially if we're doing really frame intensive, data intensive recording. But we took these things out into the middle of the Utah desert. It was like the hottest time of day, 98 degrees, and we did a bunch of hood rat stuff with the Porsches that probably is further than Nikon would have liked us to push these cameras, given their pre-production, but not a single overheating warning the entire time we were filming. We were blowing dust out of the FX6 and FX3 fans for days after the shoot.
This is what you have to do after every shoot. You don't have to worry about that with the ZR, because it's a fanless design.
And I say definitively that this will never overheat if you're doing some super long record times in a hot environment. No, but pushing the camera as much as I ever think I would, I didn't have any issues.
It's hot.
It is really hot.
It doesn't drift as well when the AC's on, so you gotta turn it off.
One thing you might have issues with, however, is when you finish up a shoot and then you go to edit and realize that you're missing that one establishing clip that'll really kind of bring the whole video together. Well, that's where Storyblocks comes in. Storyblocks is a stock media platform that offers unlimited downloads of diverse, high-quality content for one simple subscription cost. And anything you download on Storyblocks is 100% royalty-free, pre-licensed, and ready to use. Best yet, Storyblocks is committed to providing authentic stock content created by real artists, which is great in this ever-increasing world of AI content. They have over 1 million HD and 4K files, images, motion graphics templates that are all created by real artists, including a ton of DaVinci Resolve templates, which I know a ton of you that watch these videos will really appreciate. The platform is super easy to use, and the library is constantly being updated with content based on customer demand, so you're always able to make sure that you find what you need. And if you sign up now, you get an extra 2 free months when you sign up for an annual plan. So go to storyblocks.com/Meshna at the link in the description to get those 2 free months, and a huge thank you to Storyblocks for sponsoring today's video.
S5-2X. I just got bit by a freaking ant.
So even though we weren't able to get it to overheat, one reason we think it could overheat is because this is the first time we're able to shoot REDCODE RAW internally on a Nikon, or any other camera other than RED for that matter. I mean, I guess technically this is a RED, but you get the point. Now, RED sort of pioneered and then patented the ability to capture compressed RAW video internally, and when Nikon acquired them, this is kind of what they were mostly acquiring. When you're shooting on a RED, you're shooting 16-bit REDCODE RAW. On the ZR, we have 12-bit REDCODE RAW. So technically this is substantially less information and color depth than a 16-bit image, but it's still quite a bit more than most 10-bit images that we've been using lately. I think I actually prefer this smaller 12-bit version since it's much less difficult to work with from a file management and workflow standpoint, while you still get RED's legendary color science. For those who haven't worked in RAW video before, you also get the ability to adjust your white balance and ISO in post. Now, on that topic, with these being pre-production models, we were a bit limited in our ability to take full advantage of this new RAW format. Because while it's similar to the R3D format in RED cameras, it's not currently supported by editing software. So we can't make use of things like DaVinci's Camera Raw or Nitrate or all the ways that you can manage these files in like Premiere or Final Cut or Resolve, for example. What we have to do instead right now is open them in RED's Cine X Pro software and then transcode them to ProRes to work with the files from there. My understanding is that this is going to be solved by all the major editing softwares soon, but I'm not exactly positive when soon is. And I'll just say that this transcoding process it absolutely sucks. It took like 48 hours to do like 1.5 terabytes of footage, which is not super fun. But I would feel hopeful that by the time you actually get this camera in your hands, you wouldn't have to deal with that struggle. Let's talk formats. So the ZR can record 6K up to 60 frames per second with no crop, and it can do all of this in 12-bit RED RAW or Nikon's 12-bit NRAW. We also have 4K up to 60 frames per second with no crop, and then 4K 120 in a Super 35 crop. It also supports 12-bit ProRes RAW, 10-bit H.265 and H.264. Now there is a ton of configuration with what's available for each recording mode and frame rate, and it would take a long time to list them all off. So I'm gonna put up some charts on the screen so you can kind of pause and make sure that what you need or want is supported. But you can basically do 4K and 6K up to 60 frames a second with no crop, and then 4K 120 with a crop. You can also do 1080 at 240 frames per second with like a 5% crop as well. All this is to say that this is an insanely capable camera that sacrifices very little in the way of video specs and frame rates. Like, this is probably the most robust value to frame rate codec combination you could possibly find. Given it shares the sensor with the Z6 III, we also have a dual base ISO of 800 and 5000, so you see the best dynamic range and noise performance at those ISOs. Now, with normal RED cameras, ISO is actually more of a lookup table, and there aren't these same like base ISO settings in the same way that we see in most mirrorless cameras. My assumption is that the ZR is going to handle ISO a lot like how we're more used to Nikon and other mirrorless cameras rather than how RED manages it. But you'll probably have to like watch Gerald Undone's video for that. Like, I don't have the Imatest things available to do like a true one-to-one comparison. In general though, I would say that this camera is much more Nikon than it is RED, which may be good for many people because RED, it can be like a steep learning curve with, you know, stoplight exposure metering and black shading and long boot up times. It's just generally a more cumbersome workflow that's more kind of reserved for like the pro level workflow. The menu system is also decidedly Nikon, and I'll be the first to admit that Nikon's menus are pretty cumbersome as well. They do allow for a lot of customization, but there's a bit of out-of-the-box setup to get things where you want them. I think having limited custom button options actually might make it a little bit more difficult versus your standard Nikon, because when I set up my Nikon cameras, I usually do a lot of custom button mapping to do things like autofocus, for example. I have a whole video on Nikon autofocus setup, which I'll link to up here and in the description if you haven't seen that one already. But we do get some new to Nikon menu settings like shutter angle, focus peaking, user LUT input, and some RED created picture controls as well, which is kind of like Nikon's version of film simulations. There's also a few things like product display option where you like hold up something to the camera and it'll lock onto that instead of your face, and a cinematic option. Both of these honestly feel a little bit gimmicky to me, and it kind of feels like a weird way to market to a crowd that probably has no need for REDCODE RAW, but that's some of the confusion that I'm having that we'll get to in a second. To the autofocus topic real quick, it is honestly super impressive on the ZR. I think Nikon's latest gen of cameras is probably second to Sony only in terms of autofocus performance. Sony still wins in subject tracking, and just like the AI autofocus stuff that it has works super well straight out of the box, whereas Nikon takes a little bit more massaging to get the exact right autofocus setup for each scenario. But when you're in full-time AF with the subject tracking, it does a pretty good job most of the time. We're gonna be doing a quick little test of the full-time autofocus with full-time filmmaker. Look at that integration right there. There's just some instances where you probably want to switch to like, you know, full area to a restrictive box, and the ZR just doesn't have quite the custom button layout for you to be able to quickly switch that without digging into that eye menu. But another great thing about the ZR, and one reason I think it actually can challenge the FX3 to become a new go-to for creators and lower level budget filmmaking, is that if you're coming from the Sony ecosystem, you don't really have to make as big of an investment into switching. Nikon obviously has some great lenses. We got to try out some of their new ones, like their 24-70 internal zoom. I think it's the first ever 24-70 f2 with internal zoom. It's a cool lens, but if you wanted to switch, you already have a bunch of E-mount lenses as well, the E-mount and the Z-mount, they're like really good buds. They work super well together, and all you need is a very cheap and small Megadap adapter. This is a super small little adapter that allows you to use your Sony lenses on Nikon Z-mount cameras with very little drop off in things like autofocus performance. You can even do some customization to the programmable function buttons on your Sony lenses when it's attached. It's basically invisible, like you can barely even see it between the lens and the actual mount. So if you've ever been tempted to leave Sony but the lens ecosystem was too good to give up, the good news is you don't really have to with the ZR. Now, while using Sony lenses is really easy, one thing that was a big bummer for me and my time with the ZR is that there's currently no anamorphic D-squeeze support. As someone who films a lot of anamorphic in almost every possible scenario these days, this is a huge negative to me and something I gave very strong negative feedback to Nikon about. Their official word is that it's something that they're working on and that they hope to bring in a future firmware update. And like, that's great and all, but I think when we review things, we need to base it off the status that they are today. I will say, eyeballing D-squeeze on this large screen, especially having that little manual focus punch rocker thing, it makes it easier than on most other cameras. But I personally, like, that is a near deal breaker for me. Another thing that isn't guaranteed and might be a deal breaker for many is OpenGate. Again, the ZR currently has no OpenGate support in any of the recording modes, which is another big point that I gave as feedback to Nikon when testing the camera. And again, they said they're looking into providing this via a firmware update. On the one hand, this is the same sensor. I'm pretty sure it's like the same sensor we have in the Lumix S1 II, which offers 6K OpenGate. So from a hardware perspective, I'm pretty sure this is possible, but I think OpenGate is not as easy to flip the switch on as many people would think. So while I very much hope this does come, I'm not holding my breath that it will. Admittedly, I've been filming on the FX3, which doesn't have OpenGate or great anamorphic support, and I've been fine for years. But for a camera that's released in 2025, I think these are starting to become the new table stakes. And at least Sony offers full-size HDMI and an incredible monitor and control app that allows you to use your phone as a low-profile monitor. I am literally monitoring myself in anamorphic right now. But shifting back to positives, the image stabilization, it is super impressive. Nikon says it's rated for 7.5 stops, which I'm a little bit dubious of giving stop ratings in video. I don't exactly see how they calculate that, but from experience, I would say it does a really good job. If you're doing the kind of normal gimbal move type stuff, it looks super solid until you hit like a really big bump and then you get that jumping warp at times, but I don't think there's a camera out there that would have been able to correct for that. I find it a bit more natural with the normal vibration reduction rather than the electronic. And we even did a test where Johnny was just running full sprint behind me as I ripped the Porsche. And like, I don't know how many stops I'm gonna rate that for, but it was honestly probably one of my favorite shots of the entire shoot. So it's good enough for me. Another thing that I really enjoy is the audio from the ZR. So it has 32-bit float recording internally. So if you're using a mic that has 32-bit float pass-through, that will make use of the full 32-bit float recording. The internal mics are also pretty solid, so if you're in a pinch, you just want to run around without a mic, or you need to do like some scratch audio, I found those to be pretty solid as well. The hot shoe is also a digital hot shoe, which currently Nikon doesn't have anything that really supports this, but they're apparently coming out with a digital shotgun mic, like similar to the ones that Sony offers, and they're supposedly collaborating with a third-party brand to make an XLR handle. But again, we're just reviewing it as it is now. We don't have those things. Still, I think it's great to see those additions coming to the Nikon lineup, and there's a lot of brands that are able to make things knowing that that digital hot shoe is available. So this video would not be complete without a discussion about price. The Nikon ZR is coming in at around $2,100, which is honestly kind of absurd considering what you're getting from a specs standpoint. Like, to get full frame 6K 60 REDCODE RAW for $2,100, that is insanity. To this point, the minimum you're spending to get Red RAW is like $3K for the old Komodo, but that's a Super 35 image and you need a bunch of other accessories to get it to be like a usable camera. So you're really looking at like, you know, like 10,000+. Then there's the Komodo X, but that's also Super 35. That starts at 7K, and then you do a full build out, you're looking at like 12 to 14,000 for that. So that means that now this is the cheapest and easiest to use Red RAW that you will ever find. And that is awesome. But
when is Red gonna make a photo camera? We'd spend like 30 grand for a photo camera from Red.
here's where I'm left a little bit confused and torn on this camera. Most of the exciting and new things from this camera is that Red RAW recording. While it's a much simpler to use workflow than going full-blown Red, I think people that are gonna get the most use out of this are the folks that need it for the higher end image or are pretty advanced in their editing and color grading workflow. But this camera also lacks a ton of things that that same user probably sees as non-negotiable. Solid ergonomics, or the ability to rig it up like a box style camera to create your own ergonomics. The ability to record open gate for multiple aspect deliveries. Anamorphic support and pro level exposure and focus controls. Professional IO like SDI or at least full-size HDMI. Missing these things and having more of that gimmicky stuff like the cinematic mode, that's a little bit weird. However, I think it's also important to remember that this is still very early days for this Red and Nikon partnership. The Z-mount Komodo X felt very Red with a hint of Nikon. The ZR feels very Nikon with a hint of Red. I personally would like to see there be a little bit more of middle ground. This is just the first step. The Z6 III is not Nikon's flagship camera, so this having the same sensor is obviously not gonna be Nikon's flagship cinema camera. I'd love to see something that has all of Nikon's settings in the photo modes and then utilizes more of Red's menu and user experience in the video modes, but then maybe still has that option for this like 12-bit version. This is a really freaking cool camera, and at the price point, it is awesome. And I think this kind of becomes like a gateway drug into Red, which is good. Like that's cool. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.